My father planned to destroy my reputation before 30 relatives at Thanksgiving. He used the weapon every family fears most, a story, sounding perfectly like the truth. He forgot one detail. Real documents do not tremble, cry, or forget dates. When I dropped my envelope onto the dining table, the room realized too late they had not gathered for a reunion. They were invited to watch a lie be dissected alive. I am Adriana Kendrick. I am 34 years old. I work as a contract compliance manager for Northvale Health Systems in Columbus, Ohio. My professional life is defined by a ruthless attention to detail. I spend my days auditing million-dollar healthcare vendor agreements. I hunt for discrepancies. I find the hidden clauses. I track the missing funds. My entire career is built on reading what people desperately try to hide between the lines. I am trained to look past the smile and focus entirely on the ledger. Yet, as I stood on the porch of Aunt Beth Harwood's house this Thanksgiving, pulling my coat tighter against the biting wind, I realized the most dangerous and deceptive contract I had ever been written into was my own family's. The weather was unusually bitter for late November. The frost had already hardened the front lawn into a brittle sheet of gray, but the air inside the house felt sharply colder. A stark contrast to the aggressive heat blasting from the floor vents. It was a localized, suffocating drop in atmospheric pressure. I stepped into the cramped foyer and hung up my coat. The low, steady murmur of voices drifting from the living room died out instantly the moment my boots hit the hardwood. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and deeply rehearsed. I walked slowly into the dining area. There were nearly 30 people crammed into the expanded space. The room smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and the sharp, metallic scent of human anxiety. Aunt Beth had pushed 3 separate tables together to form one massive, continuous runway of white linen, crystal, and silverware. I scanned the faces staring back at me. Cousin Greg from Seattle was there, a man who had not flown east for a holiday in a decade. Great Uncle Harrison sat near the corner, leaning heavily on his cane. He had refused to travel for 7 years. These were not the usual holiday regulars. This was a deliberately summoned crowd. This was a jury. Someone had gathered them here to watch a spectacle. They were the audience, and the curtain was about to rise. At the absolute head of the table sat my father, Calvin Kendrick. He wore a sharp, tailored, charcoal gray suit jacket over a crisp, heavily starched button-down shirt. You do not wear a dark business suit to carve a family turkey unless you are treating the dining room like a courtroom. He did not look like a man preparing to give thanks for his blessings. He sat completely motionless, his hands folded neatly and precisely over his empty china plate, his eyes tracking me as I navigated the room. He looked exactly like a judge waiting for the defendant to take the stand for cross-examination. To his immediate right was my mother, Lorraine Kendrick. She was already deeply submerged in her carefully constructed role. She clutched a crumpled white tissue in her left hand, twisting it nervously. Her eyes were rimmed with a precise, strategic shade of red. Every time someone walked past her chair, she would look up and offer a fragile, trembling smile, sighing just loudly enough to ensure her profound sorrow was registered on the public record. She was the grieving mother, burdened by a terrible, unspeakable secret, playing the martyr before the first drop of hot gravy even hit the mashed potatoes. No one approached to hug me. A few relatives offered tight, closed-lipped smiles that did not reach their eyes. I found my assigned seat. It was positioned near the exact middle of the table, isolated and highly visible. The chairs to my immediate left and right were occupied by distant cousins who suddenly found the intricate floral pattern on their cloth napkins intensely fascinating. I sat down. I did not fidget. I smoothed the fabric of my skirt. I poured myself a tall glass of ice water. I waited. Dinner commenced, but it was a grotesque pantomime of a meal. The usual chaotic, joyful overlap of family arguments, loud sports debates, and genuine laughter was entirely absent. The only sounds echoing in the large room were the harsh scrape of metal forks against porcelain plates and the quiet, strained requests to pass the cranberry sauce. The tension was a living, breathing entity hovering over the table. I ate slowly, forcing myself to chew. I tasted absolutely nothing. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead. I knew exactly what was coming. I just did not know exactly when the steel jaws of the trap would spring shut. It happened right after the dinner plates were cleared away by Aunt Beth, just before the pie was supposed to be served. Calvin picked up his heavy crystal water glass. He picked up his polished silver butter knife. He raised his hand and tapped the metal firmly against the crystal rim. Clink, clink, clink. The faint, nervous murmur of forced conversation snapped shut like a vault door. All 29 heads turned simultaneously toward the head of the table. The silence was absolute and deafening. Calvin stood up slowly. He adjusted the lapels of his suit jacket. He looked down the long white expanse of the table, letting his hard gaze sweep over the captive audience to ensure he had their complete, undivided attention. "Family," Calvin began. His voice was a practiced, resonant baritone. It was the voice of a man carrying a heavy, unbearable cross for the sake of truth. "I want to thank you all for being here today. It means the world to Lorraine and me. We needed you here tonight, because tonight, we are not just sharing a meal. We are dealing with a tragedy, a severe moral issue that has broken our hearts and fractured this family." My mother let out a soft, perfectly timed, ragged sob. She pressed the crumpled tissue hard against her trembling lips. Aunt Beth reached over quickly and patted Lorraine's shaking shoulder, glaring down the table in my direction. "We have always prided ourselves on our unwavering honesty," Calvin continued, his voice rising slightly in volume, his eyes finally locking onto mine like laser sights. The warm paternal facade was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. "We honor our elders. We protect our own. But recently, we uncovered a betrayal so deep, so sickening, and so cowardly that it cannot be kept behind closed doors anymore." He paused dramatically. He let the harsh words hang in the stagnant, overheated air of the dining room. "Before my mother, your grandmother, Vivian, passed away," Calvin said, his voice dropping into a solemn, grieving octave. "She was incredibly vulnerable. She was confused. Her mind was slipping. And someone sitting in this very room took advantage of that tragic confusion." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled violently through the room. I felt 30 pairs of eyes snap toward me like a physical blow. They already knew. The insidious whisper campaign my parents had orchestrated over the past few weeks had been highly effective. Calvin raised his arm and pointed a rigid, unwavering finger straight at my face. "Adriana, you manipulated a dying woman. You stole money from her private accounts. You took valuable property from her home. You robbed your own grandmother blind while she was taking her final breaths." The raw accusation hit the crowded room like a physical shockwave. Someone at the far end of the long table gasped loudly. Cousin Sarah quickly covered her mouth with both hands. The heavy silence that immediately followed was so absolute, so suffocating, that I could clearly hear the low mechanical hum of the refrigerator out in the kitchen. Calvin reached deliberately into the breast pocket of his dark suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp, stark white envelope. He tossed it violently onto the table. He pushed it hard with the flat of his hand. The white envelope slid smoothly across the polished mahogany, passing the elaborate floral centerpiece, passing the empty gravy boat, until it stopped exactly 3 inches from my water glass. "That is legal paperwork," Calvin announced loudly, his voice ringing sharply off the walls. "It details absolutely everything you took from her. We have the undeniable proof. We want it all back. Adriana, every single cent. Or we are going directly to the police tomorrow morning." This was the precise moment they had choreographed for months. This was the exact second I was supposed to shatter into a million pieces. I was supposed to burst into hysterical tears. I was supposed to stammer out a messy, panicked, incoherent denial. I was supposed to push my chair back violently, knock over my water glass, and run out the front door into the freezing night in a cloud of manufactured, pathetic guilt. That was the script my father had meticulously written. He needed my public panic to validate his massive lie. He needed my cowardly retreat to seal his false narrative into undisputed family history forever. I looked down at the white envelope resting on the tablecloth. It was incredibly thin. It looked flimsy. I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not break eye contact. I did not run. I looked up slowly from the thin white envelope and met my father's aggressive stare. The absolute, arrogant confidence in his eyes flickered, just for a microscopic fraction of a second. As he realized I was not reading from his script, I reached out calmly and rested my fingertips lightly on the sharp edge of the white paper. I felt the steady, calm, powerful rhythm of my own pulse beating in my wrists. I smiled. It was a very small, very quiet, very dangerous smile, because for the last 5 excruciating months, I had been building a case of my own. My father thought he was springing a brilliant, inescapable trap in front of 30 witnesses. He had absolutely no idea he had just walked himself directly into a slaughterhouse. Deep inside my heavy leather tote bag, resting on the floor next to my chair, sat a thick, tightly bound manila envelope. It was exponentially thicker than his pathetic prop. It was undeniably real. And it was going to burn his entire carefully constructed life to the absolute ground. 8 months before the Thanksgiving dinner, my grandmother, Vivian Kendrick, died of a massive stroke. The drive from Columbus down to the small, quiet town of Blackthorn Ridge took me just over 2 hours, but it felt like dragging my car through wet cement. The late winter sky was the color of bruised iron, pressing down on the bare trees lining the highway. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, fighting a suffocating wave of guilt that had nothing to do with the road. For the last 2 years of her life, my grandmother had practically vanished from my world. My weekly Sunday phone calls went straight to voicemail. The long, handwritten letters I mailed her went unanswered. Even my text messages, checking in on her health, were met with an absolute, baffling silence. I had convinced myself she was just getting older, slipping into the natural isolation of aging. I did not know then that her isolation had been carefully manufactured. Blackthorn Ridge was the kind of town where everyone knew what you bought at the grocery store. Vivian had been a pillar there. She left behind a sprawling, century-old Victorian house on the edge of town, a sturdy brick commercial building right on Main Street, and a substantial family investment trust she had meticulously built over 4 decades. She was not a wealthy tycoon, but she was entirely secure. She possessed the kind of quiet, generational stability that commands immediate respect. The funeral service at the local Methodist church was packed. The air inside was thick with the suffocating scent of white lilies and damp wool coats. When my father, Calvin, stepped up to the polished wooden podium to deliver the eulogy, the congregation fell into a reverent hush. I sat in the second row, watching him carefully. His speech was entirely flawless. It was a masterpiece of emotional pacing. He spoke of his mother with a trembling voice that never actually broke, sharing warm, folksy anecdotes about her baking and her gentle wisdom. He painted a magnificent portrait of himself as the fiercely devoted, exhausted son who had spent his final years sacrificing everything to ensure her comfort. The delivery was incredibly smooth. It felt rehearsed down to the very last breath. There was no raw, ugly, unpredictable grief in his eyes. He was not mourning a mother. He was managing a public relations campaign. He was cementing the narrative of his absolute sainthood before her body was even in the ground. The true sickness of the situation did not reveal itself until later that afternoon. We gathered back at Vivian's large Victorian home for the traditional post-burial reception. The dining room table was covered with foil-wrapped casseroles and plates of cold cuts brought by well-meaning neighbors. People spoke in hushed, respectful whispers. The atmosphere was appropriately somber until Calvin positioned himself deliberately by the grand stone fireplace in the living room. He cleared his throat loudly, drawing the attention of the immediate family and a few lingering, close relatives. He adjusted his dark tie, adopting a heavy, burdened posture. "I know today is a day for remembering Mom," Calvin began, his voice laced with an exhausted sorrow. "But as the executor, I feel a profound responsibility to give the family a brief, unfortunate update regarding the estate." The room went still. Talk of money at a funeral reception is usually a strict taboo, but Calvin plowed forward with a grim determination. "I am afraid things are not as Mom left them." He sighed heavily, looking down at his polished leather shoes. "The trust, which we all assumed was healthy, has been severely depleted. The costs of her specialized at-home care over the last 2 years were staggering. We had unexpected massive property taxes. We had to do emergency structural repairs on the commercial building just to keep it up to code. I am heartbroken to say that the assets are practically gone." A murmur of shock rippled through the aunts and uncles standing near the sofa. Calvin slowly raised his head. His eyes drifted across the room, bypassing everyone else, until they locked squarely onto me. "As many of you know," Calvin said, his tone shifting from sorrowful to gently probing, "when Mom first started getting weak several years ago, Adriana was the only one who had direct access to her private paperwork. She was the one looking at the trust accounts." He paused, letting the implication hang in the quiet room like a poisonous vapor. "Adriana, sweetheart, as we go through probate, we are finding several large, unexplained withdrawals from that time period. We were really hoping you could help us clear up these confusing discrepancies." The shift in the room was immediate and visceral. It was as if the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The comforting, sympathetic glances I had been receiving from my relatives all afternoon abruptly vanished. They were replaced by narrowed eyes and tight lips. My aunt shifted her weight, physically stepping half a pace away from me. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his words, my mother, Lorraine, stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. She was holding a tray of lukewarm coffee cups. "Calvin, please," Lorraine pleaded. Her voice was thin, fragile, and dripping with a manufactured, maternal agony. "Please do not do this right now. Not today. I simply cannot bear to think my own daughter would be involved with her grandmother's money. There must be another explanation. Do not accuse her." It was a brilliant, devastating maneuver. By begging him not to accuse me, she validated the accusation itself. She solidified the idea that there was a crime, and that I was the prime suspect, all while playing the tragic protective mother. I stood frozen near the hallway. I did not speak. My mind was racing, furiously pulling up memories of my grandmother. Vivian Kendrick was the most fiercely organized human being I had ever known. She kept a detailed, color-coded ledger for every single household expense. She balanced her checkbook to the exact penny every Sunday evening at the kitchen table. She absolutely despised financial ambiguity. She had sat me down once, looking me dead in the eye, and told me that when her time came, every single asset would be laid out completely flat on the table for her 4 grandchildren. There would be no secrets. There would be no shadowy corners. Yet here was my father, waving his hands and claiming her entire life's work had vanished into a blurry fog of taxes and vague repairs. It was a complete contradiction of everything Vivian stood for. I looked at Calvin's deeply serious, sorrowful face. I looked at Lorraine's trembling, tear-filled eyes. A profound, icy chill slid down my spine, settling deep into my stomach. The missing phone calls, the unanswered letters, the sudden, catastrophic draining of a perfectly managed trust. The incredibly convenient timing of this public questioning, as I stood in the house that still smelled faintly of my grandmother's lavender soap, the devastating reality finally locked into place. This was never just a tragic story of natural loss and financial misfortune. Someone had systematically isolated an old woman. Someone had bled her dry in the dark. And as I watched my family stare at me with rising suspicion, I realized they were not just burying my grandmother today. They were aggressively hammering the nails into the coffin of the truth. making absolutely sure they buried my reputation right alongside her before anyone could dare to look inside. 6 years ago, my grandmother began to misplace her reading glasses and forget the names of minor acquaintances. It was nothing catastrophic, just the gentle, fraying edges of a sharp mind. My parents pounced on this vulnerability with breathtaking speed. They insisted on establishing a revocable family trust to protect her assets. To my absolute shock, they demanded I be named the backup co-trustee. My career in contract compliance made me the logical choice. I managed complex corporate documents for a living. I was thorough. I was the reliable, boring daughter who never missed a deadline. When Calvin initially explained the trust structure to me, he laid out a thick binder on the kitchen table. He pointed out the succession clauses, the fiduciary duties, and the ironclad rules regarding the liquidation of the commercial building. He made sure I understood the gravity of the backup co-trustee position. If anything happened to him, or if he was deemed incapacitated, the entire financial structure of the family would instantly default to my control. He made me feel like the ultimate safeguard. I did not realize he was just establishing my fingerprints on the weapon before the crime even took place. For the first time in my entire life, my parents showered me with relentless, intoxicating praise. Calvin would clasp my shoulder at Sunday dinners and tell everyone how proud he was of my meticulous nature. Lorraine would smile warmly and say they could finally sleep at night knowing my sharp eyes were watching over the family legacy. It was a potent psychological narcotic. When you spend 3 decades starving for the genuine approval of your parents, you do not question the sudden feast. You just sit down and eat. I believed they finally respected my professional capabilities. I believed we were operating as a unified front to protect a woman we all loved. The trap snapped shut during a chaotic weekend just under 4 years ago. Vivian had suffered a mild fall and was admitted to the hospital for observation. The atmosphere my mother created in the waiting room was a masterclass in manufactured panic. Lorraine paced the linoleum floor, wringing her hands. Her voice pitched in a breathless, frantic register. She orchestrated a sensory overload. Sirens were blaring outside the emergency room doors. Overhead intercoms were barking out medical codes. She cornered me near the vending machines, clutching a heavy clipboard loaded with paperwork. She grabbed my forearms with her cold, trembling hands and looked deep into my eyes, weaponizing a mother's desperate fear. "Adriana, sweetheart, the hospital administration is being incredibly difficult," Lorraine said, shoving a pen into my hand. "They will not move her to the specialized neurological wing without these authorizations. Your father is arguing with the billing department right now. They need immediate authorization to coordinate her medical benefits and set up temporary banking access to pay for these specialized scans. I need you to sign these temporary medical and banking coordination forms right now so they do not delay her treatment." I was a contract compliance manager. My entire professional existence revolved around reading the fine print. But standing in that sterile, harsh fluorescent light, looking at my mother's terrified face, the professional boundary dissolved. I was just a frightened granddaughter. The urgency was entirely manufactured, but in that highly charged atmosphere, I abandoned every single protocol I strictly enforced in my corporate life. I did not flip through the dense, stapled pages. I did not look for the notary seal or the specific indemnification clauses. I took the pen. I flipped to the very last page, where a bright yellow sticky note indicated the signature line, and I signed my name. I passed the clipboard back. Lorraine pulled me into a tight hug, her panic vanishing in an instant. I had no idea I had just sealed my own fate. The truth about what I had signed did not come to light until 6 months later. I called my father to request the biannual trust accounting reports, just to review the hospital expenditures and ensure the accounts were balanced. Calvin's tone over the phone was utterly devoid of the warmth he had faked earlier that year. It was flat, bureaucratic, and chillingly distant. "You do not have the authorization to request those documents, Adriana," he said smoothly. "You voluntarily stepped down. You signed the formal resignation. You completely removed yourself as the backup co-trustee. We filed the paperwork with the county." The room spun. The temporary medical forms my mother had pushed into my hands in the hospital waiting room never existed. The signature page I had hurriedly signed had been attached to a completely different document. It was a legally binding abdication. When I demanded to see the original document, Calvin simply hung up the phone. The coldness of his voice when he revealed the truth was the exact moment the gaslighting became tangible. Whenever I tried to argue in the weeks that followed, he repeated his lie with such absolute, unwavering conviction that for a terrifying fraction of a second, I actually questioned my own sanity. That is the insidious nature of toxic family control. They do not just lie to you, they forcefully rewrite your reality until you start doubting your own memory. They used my implicit trust as a blindfold, and then mocked me for not seeing the trap. From that precise moment, an invisible, impenetrable wall descended around Vivian. The systematic isolation began. It was a masterstroke of passive-aggressive control. It was never a sudden, violent cutoff. That would have raised suspicions. It was a slow, agonizing fade. Every time I drove down to Blackthorn Ridge, Lorraine would intercept me on the front porch, claiming Vivian was heavily medicated or sleeping. If I mailed a colorful greeting card for her birthday, Lorraine would later claim it must have gotten lost in the postal system. If I tried to arrange a weekend visit, Calvin would call me the night before, speaking in a hushed, sorrowful tone, explaining that Vivian was having a bad cognitive day and that seeing me would only cause her unnecessary distress. They became the absolute gatekeepers of her existence. They wrapped her in a thick, suffocating blanket of isolation under the absolute guise of medical protection. They created a hermetically sealed environment where they were her only source of truth, and I was quietly, efficiently erased from her daily reality. The true horror of their strategy hit me long after that initial phone call. The betrayal was not a crime of opportunity. It was a highly structured, long-term operation. They had deliberately weaponized my own professional competence against me. By initially naming me in the trust, they established a documented history of my involvement with the family finances. I was the expert. I was the one who understood how limited liability companies and asset transfers functioned. They knew that if the well ever ran dry, if anyone ever started asking dangerous questions about where the money went, they needed a scapegoat who fit the profile perfectly. Who better to blame for a sophisticated financial manipulation than the family's resident contract compliance manager? If a random relative was accused of moving assets, people would doubt they had the technical knowledge to pull it off. But if Calvin accused me, it would sound incredibly plausible. He had spent months loudly praising my financial acumen to anyone who would listen, planting the seeds of my capability in the minds of our extended family. The realization was a physical weight pressing against my chest. The knife in my back had not been plunged in out of nowhere. It had been carefully, lovingly slipped between my ribs years ago, guided by the smiling faces of the two people who were supposed to protect me from the rest of the world. I did not start my counteroffensive by making angry phone calls or demanding a dramatic family meeting. I started with the dull, unglamorous reality of public county records. My career in contract compliance taught me a fundamental truth about human deception. People can lie with profound conviction, but properly filed paperwork always leaves a permanent, traceable shadow. I spent my evenings hunched over my dining table, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of my laptop screen. I paid the standard $5 per document to access the county auditor's database. I pulled property tax data, historical building permits, and state business reports. The digital archives of the county were clunky and slow, but they were absolute. It took me exactly 4 days to find the first massive bleeding anomaly. I was tracking the deed history for my grandmother's brick commercial building located directly on Main Street. It was a prime piece of real estate she had held for over 40 years. According to the county recorder's timestamp, exactly 3 weeks after we buried her in the frozen ground, that property was quietly transferred out of the family trust. The listed buyer was an entity called Ridge Lantern Holdings, LLC. The sale price recorded on the public deed was appallingly low. The building was sold for roughly 30% of its actual conservative market value. It was practically given away. I pivoted my search to the State Business Registry to find the architects behind Ridge Lantern Holdings. The corporate veil was insultingly thin. The company had no functional website. There was no listed telephone number. The physical business address was simply a rented mailbox situated in a rundown strip mall 2 towns over. But the registered agent who filed the initial articles of organization caught my eye immediately. It was a partner at a mid-sized accounting firm operating out of Dayton. It was the exact same accounting firm my father had utilized for his personal business taxes for the last 15 years. The arrogance of the maneuver was breathtaking. They did not even bother to build a deep, complex wall to hide the theft. They just painted a very thin door and assumed I would never possess the leverage or the audacity to turn the knob. While I was meticulously tracking paper trails in the dark, my parents were actively salting the earth in the daylight. The poison of their smear campaign seeped out slowly, contaminating my life drop by drop. It started with a subtle, chilling shift in the atmosphere whenever I visited my hometown for groceries or errands. An older woman who had sat 2 pews behind our family at church for over 2 decades saw me in the produce aisle of the local market. She abruptly abandoned her shopping cart, turned her head sharply, and hurried toward the dairy section to avoid speaking to me. Then, a distant cousin from my mother's side called my phone under the guise of checking in. 10 minutes into the conversation, she asked, her tone dripping with casual suspicion, if it was true that I had brought an aggressive lawyer to my grandmother's house to force her to sign property sale papers while she was heavily medicated. The sheer specificity of the lie made my blood run cold. They were deliberately seeding a false narrative. They were preemptively creating a rumor that would perfectly explain the very property transfers I was currently uncovering. If anyone ever found out the building was sold, the town would already believe I was the one who forced the sale. The absolute breaking point, however, happened at my office in Columbus. The sanctuary of my professional life was breached. I was standing by the break room coffee machine on a Tuesday morning when a senior director at Northvale Health Systems leaned in close. He looked around to ensure the hallway was empty, then lowered his voice. "Adriana," he said gently, "I heard through the grapevine you are dealing with some incredibly ugly family financial disputes. Please let Human Resources know if you need to take some administrative leave to handle the legal mess." I froze, holding my paper cup. The rumor had crawled out of a small rural town and infected a massive corporate healthcare system over 100 miles away. My father was not just stealing an inheritance. He was systematically destroying my professional credibility. He was making sure that if I ever tried to blow the whistle, I would look like a desperate, financially unstable employee lashing out at her own family. I doubled down on the paperwork. I managed to legally compel the estate attorney to release a high-level summary of the trust ledger by threatening a formal board complaint. The document I received was a masterclass in creative fiction. I scanned the columns of outgoing funds, my eyes burning. There were massive, incredibly vague withdrawals logged in the final 14 months of my grandmother's life. There was a single-line item for $45,000 labeled simply as end-of-life management. There was another entry for $32,000 designated for emergency structural repairs. The most glaring and insulting entry was a $28,000 payout categorized as comprehensive cabin maintenance. My grandmother owned a small, rustic cabin on a lake just outside the county line. I drove out there the following Saturday morning to see these comprehensive repairs for myself. I parked my car on the gravel shoulder and walked through weeds that were waist-high. The place was entirely desolate. The wooden front steps were rotting through. The roof shingles were severely curled and covered in a thick layer of dark green moss. The screen door hung off a single rusted metal hinge, banging hollowly against the door frame in the wind. There had not been a single dime spent on this property in at least 10 years. The money had simply vanished into thin air, justified by phantom repairs on a decaying structure. I stood on the crumbling porch of that silent cabin, gripping the wooden railing until splinters bit into my palms, and felt a cold, hard clarity wash over me. I realized that if I walked into a room and tried to fight my family's slander with righteous anger, I would absolutely lose. Tears are entirely debatable. Frustration and raised voices look exactly like guilt to an audience that has already been primed to hate you. I needed a weapon they could not gaslight. I needed someone who could strip the raw emotion out of the betrayal and turn the hidden flow of stolen money into cold, mathematical, undeniable evidence. I drove to Dayton on a rainy Thursday morning to meet the only person who could turn my raw suspicions into a lethal weapon. Her name was Maris Cole. She was a forensic accountant operating out of a stark, unbranded office suite on the fourth floor of a brutalist concrete building. She did not advertise her services on billboards or television. She was referred to me by an incredibly discreet corporate lawyer who whispered her name like a classified state secret. Maris specialized in dissecting family fraud, untangling complex trusts, and shattering the walls of phantom shell companies. When I sat down across from her heavy oak desk, I did not offer a tragic monologue about my childhood or cry over the memory of my grandmother. Maris was utterly immune to theatrical drama. She wore a sharp black blazer and wire-rimmed glasses, possessing the cold, analytical demeanor of a seasoned homicide detective. She did not want my tears. She wanted the paper. "I do not care about family dynamics, Adriana," Maris said, her voice dry and perfectly flat. "Anger is subjective. Grief is subjective. The math is not. I need every single bank statement you managed to secure. I need the raw wire transfer data. I need the corporate formation records for the LLC. I want all the physical repair receipts. Most importantly, I need the original digital files of any PDF documents your father or his attorney emailed you. I want the exact metadata. People lie with profound ease. The timestamps embedded in the digital code do not." I handed over a thick binder and a high-capacity encrypted flash drive. Over the next 3 weeks, Maris transformed my chaotic pile of documents into a flawless, terrifying map of financial predation. I sat in her office on a Friday afternoon to review the preliminary findings. Maris stood in front of a massive white dry erase board. It was covered in a complex web of black lines, red circles, and printed banking screenshots. It looked less like an accounting presentation and more like a criminal syndicate wiring diagram. "Your father was exceptionally greedy, but he was incredibly sloppy," Maris began, tapping the tip of a black marker against a large circle labeled Ridge Lantern Holdings. "We already knew the trust funds bled directly into this shell company, but what happens after the money enters the dark is what will ultimately bury him." She traced a thick black line from the shell company down to a cluster of smaller, seemingly unrelated accounts. Every single page of her report opened a new, devastating wound. "Money is exactly like water," Maris explained smoothly. "It always finds the lowest point. Once the capital from your grandmother's trust hit the Ridge Lantern account, it fragmented. It splintered off into a dozen different directions. I tracked a wire transfer of $18,000 directly from the shell company to pay off a massive, high-interest personal credit card belonging entirely to Calvin Kendrick. I found another transfer of $12,000 routed through a cashier's check to settle an outstanding corporate tax lien from a failed logistics business your father ran into the ground 9 years ago." I stared at the board, my chest tightening painfully. He was not just hoarding the inheritance. He was using Vivian's life savings as his personal slush fund to erase his own historical failures. "But here is the absolute masterpiece," Maris said, her voice devoid of any humor. She pointed to a printed invoice pinned to the far corner of the board. "Your father authorized a payout from the trust for nearly $60,000. The payee is listed as Hearthstone Restoration. The memo line on the check claims it was for extensive, emergency foundational work on the primary estate." She pulled a secondary document from a neat stack on her desk and slid it slowly toward me. "I pulled the state registry filings for Hearthstone Restoration," Maris continued. "The company was officially incorporated exactly 4 days before that invoice was generated. It has absolutely no digital footprint. It has no workers' compensation insurance filed with the state. It has no bonded contractors. It is a complete ghost. The registered address is a vacant dirt lot behind a diner in Springfield. Where did the $60,000 actually go? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It bounced through the Hearthstone account and landed squarely in the checking account of a high-end residential contracting firm based in your parents' zip code, Maris replied coldly. I cross-referenced the payment dates with municipal building permits. The exact week that money cleared, a permit was pulled for a massive luxury kitchen remodel at the primary residence of Calvin and Lorraine Kendrick. Custom Italian marble countertops, commercial-grade appliances. They gutted their own house and built a culinary showroom using the exact funds legally marked for your grandmother's emergency structural support. The sheer brazenness of the theft made me physically nauseous. They had sat around that brand-new marble island, drinking expensive wine and discussing how to destroy my reputation, all while standing proudly on stolen ground. But Maris was not finished. The financial tracing was just the flesh of the crime. She was about to expose the bone. She opened a separate, slim black folder. Inside were several enlarged, high-resolution photographs of signatures. When you cross the line into establishing fake vendors, you usually start cutting corners on the foundational paperwork, Maris said, handing me a heavy magnifying glass. I had a forensic document examiner look at the property transfer deed that signed the commercial building over to the shell company. They compared the signature on that deed to 50 verified, historical samples of Vivian Kendrick's handwriting from old checks, birthday cards, and tax returns. I held the glass over the enlarged document. Look closely at the apex of the letter V, Maris instructed. Your grandmother had a very fluid, continuous stroke. The signature on the transfer deed has severe micro-hesitations. There is a distinct, sharp tremor that indicates someone was drawing the letters slowly, deliberately copying a shape rather than writing naturally. The slant angle is off by 15 degrees. The rhythm of the pen pressure is completely artificial. It is a very good forgery, but under a microscope, it absolutely screams. I dropped the magnifying glass onto the desk. He forged her signature to steal the building. It gets significantly worse, Maris said softly. It was the first time she had shown even a flicker of human empathy. She pulled out the final piece of paper. It was a dark photocopy of a thick ledger book. A forged signature is difficult to prove definitively in a civil court without a prolonged, messy battle, Maris explained. But a notary seal is an absolute matter of strict state law. The property transfer deed features a bright red, official notary stamp from a man named Arthur Vance. I requested a certified copy of Arthur Vance's official notary journal for that specific month. State law requires every single notarized signature to be physically logged in that bound book with a corresponding date, time, and thumbprint. She placed the forged property deed right next to the journal photocopy. The deed is dated the 14th of November, Maris said, tapping the paper. I reviewed the journal for the 14th of November. There is absolutely no entry for Vivian Kendrick. There is no entry for a commercial property transfer. The stamp on the deed is real, but the physical presence of the signer was completely fabricated. The notary rubber-stamped a forged document without the primary party present, most likely as a quiet personal favor to your father. The room fell completely silent. The hum of the air conditioning unit suddenly sounded like a roaring jet engine. The landscape of the conflict had just shifted violently beneath my feet. This was no longer a bitter, ambiguous argument over moral obligations or family favoritism. The boundaries of bad behavior had been permanently crossed. The evidence sitting on that heavy oak desk pushed the entire situation past civil disputes and directly into the harsh, unforgiving realm of felony document forgery, severe trust abuse, and grand-scale asset embezzlement. Maris closed the black folder and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. She locked her sharp eyes directly onto mine. I am going to finalize this into a comprehensive but bound forensic report, Maris said quietly. It will be utterly bulletproof. It will contain every wire trace, every forged anomaly, every fake company filing. But I need you to understand something very clearly. Adriana, once I sign my name to this report, and once you hand this to an attorney or a judge, there is absolutely no going back. She let the heavy weight of her words settle into the room. Your family has been operating under the arrogant assumption that this is just a loud, internal misunderstanding. Maris warned. They think they can bully you into silence because families always protect their own dirt. Once you deploy this document, you are dropping a bomb on your own bloodline. Your father could face significant prison time. The public shame will completely destroy their social standing in that town. You need to be absolutely certain you want to strike this match. I looked at the whiteboard. I looked at the undeniable proof of their greed, their lies, and the intricate, suffocating trap they had built just for me. I thought about the sheer terror I felt when they tried to convince the world I was a thief. They had not hesitated for a single second to try and ruin my life. I looked back at Maris Cole. I did not need 24 hours to think it over. I did not need to consult my conscience. Finish the report, I said, my voice steady and cold. I have absolutely no interest in preserving a peace that was built entirely on a lie. Evelyn Kendrick lived exactly 140 miles north of Columbus, in a small farming community that felt entirely detached from the modern world. She was my grandmother's older cousin, a woman whose name had been systematically erased from our family gatherings over a decade ago. Calvin always claimed she was a bitter, estranged eccentric who wanted nothing to do with us. As with everything else, that was a highly curated lie. I found her address buried in the margins of a 15-year-old property tax assessment, listed as a secondary contact for an old parcel of land. I parked my car on a gravel driveway lined with towering, ancient oak trees. The farmhouse was painted a faded, peeling white, surrounded by acres of silent, dormant fields. When I knocked on the heavy wooden door, I expected a confused elderly woman. Instead, the door opened to reveal a sharp, unyielding figure. Evelyn was 82 years old, standing completely straight, her white hair pulled back into a severe knot. She possessed the exact same piercing, intelligent eyes as Vivian. She looked at me through the screen door. She did not ask what I was selling. She did not offer a polite, generic greeting. I am Adriana, I said quietly, the cold wind biting at my coat. I am Vivian's granddaughter. Evelyn studied my face for a long, heavy moment. Her expression did not soften into immediate warmth, but the strict tension around her jaw slowly released. She unlatched the screen door and pushed it open. I wondered when you would finally find your way here, Evelyn said. Her voice was thin but incredibly firm, carrying the distinct, no-nonsense cadence of the old Midwest. Come inside before you freeze. We have a considerable amount of ground to cover. The interior of the farmhouse smelled of dried lavender, wood smoke, and old paper. It was the scent of a fiercely guarded sanctuary. We sat at a sturdy oak kitchen table. She did not offer me water or tea. She simply walked over to a tall wooden hutch and retrieved a heavy fireproof steel lockbox. She set it down on the table with a solid thud. She produced a small brass key from the pocket of her wool cardigan and turned the lock. Your father always thought he was the smartest man in the room, Evelyn said, her tone dripping with quiet disdain. He assumed Vivian was just a sweet, naive woman who would eventually lose her grip and hand him the reins. He severely underestimated his mother. She saw exactly who he was long before the end. Evelyn opened the heavy lid and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. It was perfectly preserved. She slid it across the table toward me. 2 years before she passed away, Vivian took a private cab up here to see me. Evelyn explained. She was terrified. She told me Calvin was hovering. She said he was constantly bringing her convoluted paperwork under the guise of medical planning, pushing her to sign things she did not fully understand. She knew he cared far more about controlling the deeds than he did about her actual heart condition. I opened the envelope. Inside was a pristine, legally binding trust amendment. It was not a draft. It was fully executed, signed, and deeply embossed with a legitimate county seal. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs until I found the distribution clause. It entirely superseded the documents my father had been waving around. The estate was not funneled into a single, centralized account controlled by Calvin. It explicitly divided the remaining assets into 4 absolutely equal shares, one for each of her 4 grandchildren. There was also a specific, generous cash stipend carved out to thank Felicia Boone, the woman who had provided her daily in-home care for years. Tucked directly beneath the legal amendment was a piece of personalized stationery. It was a handwritten letter. The sight of Vivian's elegant, sloping cursive hit me in the chest like a physical blow. "Read it," Evelyn commanded softly. I traced my fingers over the blue ink. The letter was dated exactly 24 months before her death. Vivian wrote with absolute, chilling clarity. She stated that if anyone in the family attempted to liquidate her properties, transfer deeds, or sell her assets without the explicit documented consensus of all 4 grandchildren, they were acting in direct hostile defiance of her final wishes. She knew exactly what Calvin was planning to do, and she had built a fortified wall in the dark to stop him. She left the original with me because she knew Calvin would eventually tear her house apart looking for it. Evelyn said, "She told me to hold it until someone finally came asking the right questions. She knew he would try to silence you. She was betting on your stubbornness, Adriana." Before I left, Evelyn handed me a small, cream-colored business card. It belonged to an attorney named Daniel Voss. He is the one who drafted the amendment. Evelyn told me. He operates out of a tiny office in a strip mall 2 counties over. Calvin never knew he existed. Go see him. I drove straight to the address Evelyn provided. Daniel Voss was a man well into his 70s, wearing a tweed jacket that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old leather. His office was cluttered with towering stacks of legal briefs, but his mind was devastatingly sharp. When I showed him my driver's license and the copy of the amendment Evelyn had given me, a profound look of relief washed over his wrinkled face. "I have been waiting for a Kendrick to walk through that door for 8 months, Mr. Voss said, leaning back in his creaking leather desk chair. Vivian was a remarkable woman. When she came to me to draft that amendment, she was acutely aware that her son would eventually challenge her mental competency to invalidate the new terms. So, we took a highly irregular precaution." He swiveled his chair around, clicked a few folders on his desktop computer, and turned the heavy monitor toward me. "I recorded the signing," he said simply. "It is legally admissible proof of testamentary capacity." He pressed the space bar. The screen flickered to life. There she was, my grandmother. She looked significantly older and more fragile than the vibrant woman from my childhood memories. She was sitting in the exact chair I was currently occupying. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. But her eyes were fiercely bright, completely lucid, and filled with a determined, quiet strength. "Mr. Voss's voice echoed from off-camera, asking her to state her name, the current date, and her intentions. Vivian looked directly into the camera lens. Her voice was slightly thin, but it did not tremble. She recited the day, the month, and the year flawlessly. Then, she began to speak about the estate. She named every single one of her 4 grandchildren without a microsecond of hesitation. She spoke of our individual strengths. When she said my name, a soft, genuine smile crossed her face. "I want my family to remain a family," Vivian said on the video, her tone shifting into something hard and unyielding. "I have worked my entire life to build a foundation for these kids. I want absolute fairness. I want total transparency. Under no circumstances do I want everything to slip into the hands of one person who will just hide behind the family name to serve their own greed." The video ended. The screen faded to black. The reflection of my own face stared back at me in the dark monitor. I sat in that quiet, dusty office and felt a massive, suffocating weight lift completely off my shoulders, only to be instantly replaced by a blinding, white-hot fury. For 2 entire years, I had agonized over the silence. I had laid awake at night, wondering what I had done to make my grandmother simply stop loving me. I had accepted the painful narrative that she had just faded away, forgetting who I was in her final days. But she never forgot me. She never abandoned me. She loved me enough to orchestrate a brilliant, secret legal defense to protect my future. The silence was not her fading memory. The silence was my father. He had intercepted the letters. He had blocked the phone calls. He had built a prison around her and a wall in front of me. He had stolen her final years from me just so he could steal her money. It was the most profound, devastating emotional turning point of my entire life. I walked out of Daniel Voss's office clutching a flash drive containing the video. I was no longer a confused, grieving granddaughter trying to clear her name. I was the absolute executor of Vivian Kendrick's vengeance. Perhaps my father possessed a predator's instinct. Or maybe the sudden silence from my end of the phone lines tipped him off. Whatever the trigger was, Calvin and Lorraine must have sensed I was finally tracking the correct scent. In the 3 weeks leading up to the Thanksgiving holiday, their passive-aggressive whisper campaign mutated into an aggressive, scorched-earth crusade. They were no longer just painting me as a confused, grieving granddaughter. They were actively executing my character in the public square, utilizing the most lethal weapon in middle-class society, faux concern. My mother became the grand marshal of this parade. She began making strategic, hours-long phone calls to every single aunt, uncle, and second cousin in our sprawling family tree. She always framed these calls under the pious guise of seeking spiritual support. "Please keep our family in your prayers," Lorraine would sigh into the receiver, her voice practically vibrating with synthetic sorrow. But beneath the velvet cloak of religious devotion was a tightly coiled dagger. She meticulously planted highly specific, toxic seeds. She told Aunt Beth I was drowning in massive, undisclosed credit card debt. She whispered to Cousin Greg that the stress of my corporate job had triggered a severe mental breakdown. The most insidious lie, however, was her claim that I had harbored a lifelong, pathological obsession with the idea that Vivian favored my brother over me. Lorraine was carefully constructing a psychological profile. She was building a desperate, unstable, and envious villain. While my mother handled the emotional assassination, my father focused on the material logistics. Calvin knew he could not jump straight from zero to accusing me of grand larceny without building a bridge of plausibility first. He needed a gateway crime. He found it in the estate inventory. Shortly after the funeral, before any official counting had been completed, Calvin began quietly telling the extended family that several small, sentimental antiques had mysteriously vanished from Vivian's living room. He never made a formal police report. He just let the accusation float in the air like a foul odor. His masterpiece of manipulation centered around a specific piece of jewelry, an antique sapphire brooch Vivian rarely wore. It was missing from the master list. No one in the family actually knew when she had last worn it, or who had touched her jewelry box last. It could have been lost 5 years ago. But Calvin weaponized that missing brooch with terrifying efficiency. He began suggesting, with a heavy, disappointed shake of his head, that perhaps I had slipped it into my purse during one of my final visits, just to have a small physical memory of her. It sounded so harmless at first. A grieving girl taking a trinket, but that was the genius of his trap. Once he convinced the family I was capable of taking a small object in secret, it was only a microscopic leap of logic to convince them I was capable of taking the money. He was not trying to win a battle of concrete evidence. He was trying to win the crowd through sheer timing. His strategy was brilliant and brutal: strike first, establish the narrative, and force me to spend the rest of my life playing defense. When you are constantly screaming that you are not a thief, you look exactly like a thief. I realized I could not fight a social war with raw accounting data. A spreadsheet does not bleed, and a bank statement cannot scream. I needed a translator. I needed someone who could take Maris Cole's dense forensic accounting and Daniel Voss's heavy legal video and forge them into a single, lethal blade. I found Owen Price. He was a litigator operating out of a stark, aggressively modern office in downtown Columbus. Owen did not wear expensive Italian suits, and he did not make grand, theatrical promises. He had the cold, dead eyes of a man who spent his entire life watching families tear each other apart over money. I dropped my massive box of evidence onto his glass desk. He spent 2 entire days reading every single page. When I returned to his office, he did not offer me a sympathetic smile. "Your parents are not just greedy," Owen said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "They are highly organized sociopaths. But their arrogance is going to be their absolute undoing." Owen did not draft a complex legal brief for me to read. He understood the fundamental rule of the court of public opinion: a confused jury always sides with the best storyteller. He took the towering stack of bank records, the forged notary logs, and the secret trust amendment, and he synthesized them into a streamlined, terrifyingly clear narrative. He helped me organize the documents into a structured, chronological binder. Every single page was tabbed, highlighted, and aggressively simplified. We built a dossier that did not require a law degree to understand. It was designed to speak with devastating clarity to a room full of people who only understood the language of basic right and wrong. But Owen found something else buried in the chaos, something that completely shifted my understanding of the impending Thanksgiving dinner. I had provided him with a stack of printed emails Calvin had sent to various relatives over the past few months. Messages filled with vague complaints about the estate and subtle jabs at my character. Owen slid one of the emails across the glass desk. He tapped his pen against a specific paragraph. "Read the syntax," Owen instructed softly. "Look at the specific phrasing your father is using here. Breach of fiduciary expectation, unauthorized appropriation of familial assets, willful circumvention of standard probate procedure." I stared at the words, the cold realization slowly creeping up the back of my neck. That is not how a grieving son writes an email to his cousin. Owen continued, his voice dropping an octave. That is the precise, mechanical language of a civil complaint. He is not just venting, he is practicing. He has been rehearsing his closing arguments for months. He is going to use a large family gathering to stage a mock trial, and he intends to serve as the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The Thanksgiving dinner was never meant to be a holiday celebration. It was a carefully designed ambush. Calvin had invited all those distant relatives to guarantee a massive audience for his final act. He wanted to lock the doors, trap me in the center of the room, and publicly execute my reputation so thoroughly that no one would ever believe a single word I said about the stolen trust funds. I walked out of Owen's office and sat in my car in the parking garage for 3 solid hours. The silence of the concrete structure was deafening. The sheer weight of the decision pressing down on my chest was agonizing. I had 2 choices. I could simply stay home. I could ignore the invitation, order a cheap pizza on Thursday night, and file the civil lawsuit quietly on Monday morning. It would be the safe route. It would preserve a fragile, cowardly peace for just a few more days. I would not have to look my mother in the eye as she lied to a room full of people I had known my entire life. But if I did not show up, Calvin would win the narrative by default. My absence would be cemented as an admission of guilt. He would stand at the head of that long table, carve the turkey, and tell 30 people that I was too ashamed to show my face. He would officially christen me the thief of Blackthorn Ridge, and the family would toast to his absolute integrity. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my hands ached. The thought of letting him hold that carving knife, letting him smile that arrogant, pristine smile while standing on the ashes of my grandmother's legacy, ignited a fire in my blood that burned away every last ounce of fear. I was not going to hide in my apartment. I was going to put on my best winter coat. I was going to drive to Aunt Beth's house. I was going to walk directly into the suffocating center of his trap. I would let him build his glorious, righteous bonfire right there in the dining room. And then I would use the absolute, undeniable truth to burn his entire world down to the absolute foundation. My younger brother, Mason Kendrick, had spent his entire adult existence perfecting the art of absolute invisibility. He was the quiet one, the son who simply nodded and smiled to maintain the fragile ecosystem of our family. He avoided conflict with a religious devotion, but as the holiday approached, the sheer magnitude of our parents' lies began to crush his conscience. He watched them rehearse their sorrow. He listened to them speak with terrifying ease about things he knew were fundamentally untrue. Exactly 6 days before the Thanksgiving dinner, Mason broke his silence. He called me from a prepaid cellular phone, his voice entirely hollow. We met in the back booth of a deserted diner on the outskirts of the city. He did not offer small talk. He simply slid his smartphone across the scratched Formica table. He explained that a few weeks prior, he had stopped by our parents' house late at night to borrow a specific power drill from the garage. He had walked through the side door without knocking. As he stood in the mudroom, he heard Calvin and Lorraine arguing in the kitchen. The tone of their voices froze him in place. Recognizing the danger, Mason had silently pressed the record button on his phone and dropped it into his breast pocket. I tapped the play icon on the screen. The audio was slightly muffled by the fabric of his jacket, but the crisp, authoritative voice of my father cut through the static perfectly. If we want this to stay quiet, we make her a thief before she opens the books. Calvin hissed on the recording. I have already started making the calls. My mother's voice replied, devoid of any warmth. I told Aunt Beth she is drowning in debt. It lays the groundwork. I sat in the diner, listening to the digital ghosts of my parents planning my execution. Mason stared at his hands, tears pooling in his eyes. He had captured the exact genesis of their psychological warfare. The walls around Calvin's elaborate fiction were collapsing rapidly. Just 48 hours after my meeting with Mason, I finally tracked down Felicia Boone. She was the dedicated live-in caregiver who had spent the final 2 years with Vivian. I called her and asked a single, direct question about the enforced isolation. Felicia broke down sobbing over the line. She completely shattered the illusion that Vivian had forgotten me. She begged to call you, Felicia cried, her voice thick with long-held guilt. She would hold the telephone, and your father would physically take it out of her hands. He would look down at her and say, "Do not distract Adriana. She is working on important corporate contracts. You will only upset her and ruin her career." He weaponized your success to make her feel like an absolute burden. He made sure she died thinking you were simply too busy to care. The cruelty was so precise, so surgically applied, that it took my breath away. But the universe has a strange way of balancing the scales of justice. The very next morning, an email arrived from an unexpected source. It was from an elderly woman who lived directly across the street from Vivian's Victorian house. She was an avid bird watcher who kept a digital camera with a massive telephoto lens resting on her front windowsill. She had heard the toxic rumors my mother was aggressively spreading through the church prayer groups. The neighbor knew the rumors were false because she had been looking through her viewfinder 2 days after the funeral. She attached 4 high-resolution digital photographs to the email. The timestamps embedded in the images were indisputable. They showed Calvin and Lorraine standing in Vivian's driveway. They were hurriedly loading heavy cardboard boxes labeled living room antiques into the trunk of their luxury sedan. The date on the photos proved they were stripping the house entirely bare 3 full weeks before the county had even ordered the official estate inventory. The final, devastating puzzle piece arrived via a secure courier from my forensic accountant, Maris Cole. It was a single-page addendum to her massive financial report. Maris had caught wind of the specific rumor regarding the missing antique sapphire brooch. She did not ignore the bait. She swallowed it whole and tracked the hook. She ran the specific physical description of the jewelry through a centralized database of regional auction houses. She found the exact match. The sapphire brooch had been auctioned off at a boutique gallery in Indianapolis exactly 1 month ago. The seller had requested strict anonymity, but Maris had managed to subpoena the banking route of the final payout. The thousands of dollars generated from the sale of the stolen brooch had been wire transferred directly into the primary checking account of Ridge Lantern Holdings. My parents had physically stolen the heirloom, sold it for untraceable cash through their phantom shell company, and then loudly accused me of the theft to create a perfect smokescreen. With every single new revelation, Calvin's narrative transformed from a simple lie into a highly structured, premeditated criminal conspiracy. The villain role had been custom built for me for years. The night before Thanksgiving, a heavy, suffocating snow began to fall over Columbus. My apartment was completely silent. I stood at my kitchen island, bathed in the harsh white light of the overhead fixtures. I did not feel any anxiety. I did not feel any fear. I felt the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner preparing the gallows. I took a thick, reinforced manila envelope and began to pack the instruments of their destruction. I placed Maris Cole's legally certified financial tracing report at the very bottom, detailing every single stolen dollar. Next, I laid down the glaringly fake property transfer deeds, complete with the fabricated notary logs. On top of those, I placed the glossy, time-stamped photographs of my parents smuggling boxes of antiques out of the house. I carefully added the auction house receipts, proving they were the ones who sold the sapphire brooch. Then, I placed Evelyn's pristine, legally binding trust amendment on the stack, the document that legally distributed the entire estate into 4 equal shares and completely neutralized my father's authority. Finally, I took a small, silver USB drive. I slid it into a clear plastic protective sleeve and clipped it to the very top of the massive stack of paper. That tiny drive held the ultimate payload. It contained the high-definition video of Vivian sitting in the lawyer's office, lucid and strong, explicitly forbidding the secret sale of her assets. And right next to that video file was the scratchy, undeniable audio recording of my father plotting to turn his own daughter into a criminal. I folded the metal clasp of the manila envelope shut. I ran my hand over the thick, heavy paper. Every single exit door for Calvin and Lorraine was now permanently locked. The trap they had spent years building for me was about to snap shut on their own necks. I turned off the kitchen lights and went to sleep, completely ready for the holiday. I pulled into Aunt Beth's driveway exactly 45 minutes before the invitation stated. I wanted to observe the battlefield before the troops fully assembled. Stepping through the front door, the immediate shift in the atmospheric pressure was palpable. It did not feel like a holiday gathering. It felt like a perfectly staged theater set, and I was stepping directly onto my predetermined mark. Aunt Beth's dining room had been meticulously rearranged. The long tables were pushed together, forming a massive runway of judgment, but it was the chairs that gave the game away. Calvin's seat was positioned at the absolute head of the table, granting him an unobstructed, commanding view of every single guest. My assigned chair, marked by a small, unnecessarily formal place card, was placed dead center on the longest side. It was the only seat in the room completely exposed to the sightlines of every other chair. I was not a guest. I was the centerpiece of an impending interrogation. Before I could even take off my winter coat, my mother materialized in the foyer. Lorraine threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a suffocating, aggressively tight embrace. She held on for 3 seconds too long, pressing her cheek against mine. "Do not make things worse tonight," Lorraine whispered directly into my ear. Her voice was not trembling with maternal concern. It was a flat, cold, and calculated warning. It was the hiss of a snake demanding its prey hold still. She pulled back, immediately plastering a fragile, sorrowful smile onto her face for the benefit of Cousin Greg, who was hanging up his jacket a few feet away. I walked into the living room, gripping the thick strap of my heavy leather tote bag. The relatives who had already arrived greeted me with a highly specific brand of strained, unnatural politeness. Aunts who usually hugged me fiercely now offered brief, stiff pats on the shoulder. Uncles who used to joke with me suddenly found their shoes incredibly fascinating as I walked past. They had all been fed my mother's poisoned breadcrumbs for the past month. They were stuffed full of the debt rumors and the theft allegations. They did not fully know what to believe yet, but they knew enough to keep a safe, clinical distance from the infected patient. Aunt Beth was a nervous wreck. She was practically vibrating with a frantic, unspent energy, continuously rearranging the silver forks and adjusting the folded cloth napkins. She kept shooting panicked glances toward Calvin, then toward me, her eyes wide and deeply conflicted. She had the distinct, terrified aura of a homeowner who suddenly realizes her living room has been rented out for a public execution, but lacks the courage to kick the executioner out into the snow. Meanwhile, Calvin was absolutely thriving in his element. He was not acting like a grieving son or a concerned father. He was pacing the perimeter of the room like a seasoned Broadway director conducting a final dress rehearsal. He moved smoothly from cluster to cluster, placing a firm, reassuring hand on a cousin's shoulder, offering a warm, perfectly modulated laugh to an uncle's terrible joke. He was testing the emotional temperature of the room, ensuring his audience was primed, compliant, and thoroughly charmed before the curtain finally went up. He caught my eye from across the room and offered a slow, deeply patronizing nod. He was entirely confident he had already won. I found an empty spot near the hallway wall and stood quietly. I kept my hand resting on the smooth leather of my bag. Inside, the thick manila envelope was a physical anchor grounding me against the rising tide of their fabricated reality. I watched my family mingle and laugh, and a profound, icy calm washed over my mind. I reminded myself, with absolute clarity, that I was not walking into this dining room to win a popularity contest. I did not need these 30 people to love me by the time the night was over. I was entirely done begging for my own reputation. I was here for one single, undeniable purpose: to return the heavy burden of the truth directly to the people who had created the lie. The front door clicked open, just as Aunt Beth announced it was time to take our seats. My younger brother, Mason, slipped into the house. He looked exhausted. He kept his head bowed, aggressively avoiding eye contact with Calvin, who immediately tried to wave him over. Mason completely ignored the gesture. He found a chair near the very end of the table, physically wedging himself onto the absolute border between the loyalists and the accused. He slumped into the wooden seat, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his face twitched. He looked exactly like a man who knew the entire foundation of his family history was resting on a single, fragile wire, and that the wire was about to snap violently in half. We all sat down. The massive porcelain bowls of mashed potatoes, roasted turkey, and green beans were passed around the table in a tense, hushed silence. Nobody spoke above a strained whisper. I kept my portion small. I drank only water. The pacing of the evening was a masterclass in psychological control. Calvin waited. He waited through the entire first course. He waited until the plates were mostly empty, until everyone was physically weighed down by the heavy, rich food. He waited until the collective lethargy of a massive holiday meal settled over the room, ensuring that if things got ugly, people would be too full, too tired, and too socially paralyzed to simply stand up and walk out the front door. He needed them trapped in their chairs. The room was completely quiet, save for the low hum of the heating vent and the occasional scrape of a fork. Calvin slowly reached out with his right hand. He picked up his silver butter knife. He picked up his heavy crystal water glass. He tapped the metal against the rim. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the heavy air like a gunshot. The residual, nervous chatter died instantly. Every single head turned. I stopped breathing for one fraction of a second. I looked down the long expanse of the white tablecloth, past the half-empty gravy boats and the crumpled napkins, straight into the dark, triumphant eyes of my father. He stood up from his chair, smoothing the lapels of his suit, his face contorted into a mask of profound, manufactured grief. The waiting was over. The theater doors were locked. The play he had been aggressively scripting for the last 8 months had officially begun. Calvin stood at the head of the table. The room was paralyzed. He declared to all 30 relatives that I had deliberately drained the reserve funds meant for Vivian's end-of-life care. He added the final, polished stone to his monument of lies, stating I had also taken a highly valuable antique from her home before the state could inventory the estate. With as sharp as a theatrical flick of his wrist, he pushed the stark white envelope down the center of the long table. It slid over the white linen and stopped right next to my water glass. He looked at me with the absolute, arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had just delivered a fatal blow. He gestured toward the paper, calling it an official legal demand for immediate restitution. I picked up the envelope. I did not tremble. I broke the seal and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. It took my professionally trained eyes exactly 2 seconds to dismantle his bluff. The document was a pathetic, amateur forgery of a civil complaint. There was no assigned court docket number. There was no date stamp from a county clerk. The paragraphs were a senseless, chaotic blend of copy and pasted legal jargon that held absolutely no judicial weight. It was not a legal threat. It was a cheap theatrical prop designed entirely to intimidate a daughter he assumed was too scared to read the fine print. Instead of raising my voice, instead of bursting into the hysterical tears he desperately needed to validate his narrative, I simply set his fake letter down next to my dinner plate. I reached into my heavy leather bag and pulled out the thick, tightly bound manila envelope. I placed it squarely on the table. The heavy thud of the thick paper stack hitting the wood echoed in the silent room. "If tonight is about paperwork," I said, my voice completely level and echoing clearly across the dining room, "then let us use the real paperwork." I unclasped the metal tie. I did not throw the documents at my father. I bypassed him entirely. I handed the first organized packet directly to Aunt Beth, who sat trembling to my left, and the second packet to Great Uncle Harrison, the oldest and most universally respected voice in the extended family. "That is a certified forensic analysis of the property transfer deed Calvin filed last month," I explained calmly as Harrison adjusted his reading glasses. "The signature is a confirmed forgery. Attached to it is the official state notary log for that exact date, proving Vivian was never physically present to authorize the sale of her commercial building." Aunt Beth gasped, a sharp, ragged sound. I handed her the next document, and that is the legally binding trust amendment Vivian executed exactly 2 years ago. I continued. "It explicitly mandates that her entire estate be divided into 4 equal shares among her grandchildren. Calvin was never the sole inheritor. He had absolutely no legal authority to touch a single cent." The entire table seemed to stop breathing all at once. The fundamental pillar of my father's story, the idea that the money was his to manage, simply vaporized. Before anyone could speak, I dealt the next blow, sliding the massive, color-coded financial diagram down the center of the table. "This is the exact routing map of the stolen trust funds," I stated, locking my eyes onto Calvin, whose face was rapidly draining of all color. "The money did not go toward medical care. It was funneled into a ghost corporation called Ridge Lantern Holdings, an entity completely controlled by Calvin and Lorraine. From there, the trust paid off Calvin's old corporate tax debts, settled his personal high-interest credit cards, and financed the $50,000 custom kitchen remodel in their house." Calvin slammed his hand against the table. "This is absolute garbage," he shouted, his perfect baritone cracking into a panicked, shrill bark. "She fabricated all of this. She is lying." "She is not lying." The voice came from the far end of the table. Mason pushed his chair back and stood up. His hands were shaking violently, but he held his smartphone high in the air. He tapped the screen. The audio file began to play at maximum volume. The tinny, digital voice of our father echoed off the dining room walls, clear and undeniable. "If we want this to stay quiet, we make her a thief before she opens the books." The recording captured my mother's cold, calculating agreement. The sheer, premeditated malice hanging in the air was physically sickening. Aunt Beth covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Calvin opened his mouth to speak, to spin another thread, but I did not give him the oxygen. I stood up from my chair, grabbed the small silver drive from the top of my folder, and walked the 10 steps into the adjacent living room. I plugged it directly into the side port of Aunt Beth's massive television set and picked up the remote control. The screen flashed black, and then my grandmother's face illuminated the dark room. 30 relatives turned their chairs to face the screen. Vivian sat upright in the lawyer's office, looking directly into the camera lens. Her voice was strong, sharp, and entirely lucid. She stated her name. She recited the date. She named her 4 grandchildren, and then She delivered the final, inescapable verdict from beyond the grave. She explicitly forbade the secret liquidation of her assets. She demanded total transparency. She stated, with a profound, knowing sadness, that she refused to let one greedy person hijack the family name and hoard everything in the dark. The video ended. I turned off the television. The silence that slammed into the house was absolute and deafening. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the suffocating and toxic silence of a massive lie collapsing in on itself. Lorraine was the first to physically break. She did not cry. She did not produce her carefully folded tissue. The theatrical martyr vanished completely. She simply slumped forward, staring blankly at the cold mashed potatoes on her plate. Her silence was a profound, catastrophic surrender. She did not dare lift her head to look at her sister, her nephews, or her children. Her absolute refusal to speak was a louder confession than any apology could ever be. The social quarantine happened almost instantaneously. Great-Uncle Harrison slowly pushed his heavy wooden chair backward, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floorboards, creating a distinct, physical gap between himself and the head of the table. Cousin Greg followed, then Aunt Beth. One by one, the relatives who had spent the last month absorbing the toxic rumors began physically pulling their bodies away from Calvin and Lorraine. They wanted to drag themselves out of the blast radius. No one offered a word of defense. No one offered the benefit of the doubt. My parents were marooned at the head of a massive table, completely surrounded by family, yet entirely, hopelessly isolated. I did not scream at them. I did not demand an apology I knew would be worthless. I simply walked back to my chair, collected my thick stack of undeniable proof, and slid it neatly back into the manila envelope. "First thing Monday morning," I announced, my voice slicing cleanly through the thick, heavy air. "My attorney is filing a civil suit to immediately freeze every single asset connected to the shell company. We are legally compelling a total reopening of the estate accounting. Simultaneously, this entire binder is being handed over to the County Financial Crimes Division for criminal review." I slung the heavy leather tote bag over my shoulder. I looked at my father one last time. He was completely frozen, staring at the white tablecloth, entirely stripped of his power, his pride, and his meticulously crafted reputation. He had spent 8 months aggressively building a scaffold in the center of the town square, inviting everyone we knew to watch him hang my honor, but he forgot that a trap only works if the prey walks into it blindly. I turned my back on the head of the table and walked toward the front door. I did not reclaim the warm, joyful family dynamic I had lost. That was gone forever, burned to ash by greed. But as I stepped out into the freezing, biting winter air, I realized I had secured something far more valuable. In a room full of people who were invited to watch me lose everything, I had forcefully, permanently won back my name. Thank you all so much for listening to this story tonight. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts on this insane family drama. Please make sure to subscribe to Amelia Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and show this video some love so we can push this story out for more people to hear.